Thank you for joining us at our inaugural offerings for the NCA Job Fair Prep Talks. I'm very excited to introduce to you Dr. Claire Procopio, and she's going to be teaching you how to interview with insight.
Hello. First off is, can you hear me? We're good. Second is, who's here to hear me? Because these are very nice tables, and I get that. But okay, so I've got some sense of good. All right, well, the first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is finding out what kind of positions you are applying for. That will help me tailor this a little bit to your particular interests. So any of you, well, let me ask, how many of you are finishing up a PhD or a master's? You're in school right now finishing, okay? Some of you in a current position, though, out and coming and looking for new positions, okay? That's helpful to know, too. How many of you are looking at teaching-intensive university or institutions? Community college, small, private, regional? How many are one? Like, I'm really hoping to publish, and my research is what I'm hoping to do. All right, that makes a difference. And I ask you this in good communication fashion because I'm supposed to tailor my message to you, right? But the whole theme of what I'll say for the next 20 minutes mostly is you need to do the same thing when you meet your interview committee, right? That we teach this, but sometimes we forget this. By way of my ethos statement, because we're all comm majors, I will say to you, I have been on some serious search committees. When I first went out from Indiana University, I had PhD R1, my MA is from LSU, another R1. I had been on search committees as the grad student there. I went to a community college that had the distinction of being the fastest growing community college in the United States. We went from 1,800 students to 8,000 students in 4 years. We were always on a search committee. I have hired deans and provosts and adjuncts in every field, in history and political science and communication, in French, Spanish, German, name it. In my current position, I'm at a regional institution. We have an MA program. I've been on the dean search committee recently. I've been on assistant professor. I've been on instructor positions. Our Center for Student Excellence hired 12 counselors one year. I was on all of their search committees. I have really interviewed a lot of people. And I've seen some beautiful interviews, especially communication majors. We know how to talk to people. And yet I still think there are tips that we can have that will help you. But I have also seen what I can only describe as some really poor choices, right? People do some strange things in interviews. And so I want to tell you, some of the horror stories, some of the things to avoid, and some tips and what to do. So the first thing that I would say to any of you before you go out on a job interview, and again, this is more interviews, though I think a lot of this could apply to your cover letter as you're framing and attempting to apply. There's some general stuff about the institution you can know before you go talk to them. And then I'm going to talk about specific to the institution too. But in general, one of the things I would say to all of you is the search committee is like you. They are people, they are interested in our field, they are busy. They are trying to publish, they are trying to teach, they are trying to maintain their service commitments. That's kind of good news for you in some ways. They want to like you, right? I'm hoping you walk through the door, blow my socks off, and we can stop looking, right? And say, we're done. We've got who we need. So that's good news. Come into it with a little confidence. They're hoping to like you. They really are. By the time you get to the interview, they also think you're qualified. They wouldn't have called you if they didn't think you had the basic qualifications for the position. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about R1 interviewing. The second thing I think that you can do generally, no matter where you're applying before you come in, is think about the institution. Those of you considering teaching at a community college, it's a 5-5 teaching load. They don't care at all about your dissertation topic. If you're doing the cover letter that's the search and replace, the first paragraph is, hi, I read about your job ad here, and then the second one is, let me tell you about my dissertation, don't send it to the community college. All we think when we see that is, here's someone who will not like it here. They are not going to have time to do that kind of research. You should start with your teaching, right? You want to talk teaching, then service, and then say, and I'm going to stay professionally active. That's what we're looking for at the community college. Tell us you're going to get to NCA. If you're thinking of the liberal arts college, do you like women's lacrosse? How do you feel about Wednesday night choir attendance? Are you Catholic? Because the small private cares. Their institutional missions are very narrow, very defined. They serve very specific constituencies. Those students pay a lot of money to have a small faculty-student ratio. You need to be ready and you need to be willing in that kind of interview scenario to talk about what you bring to the table for that kind of time-intensive commitment. If you're like me and you're looking at the regional institution, you better be able to say you can teach and still publish. It doesn't have to be publication at the level of an R1, but you're going to have to be professionally active. If you're coming into the R1, you need to be prepared at the interview to talk about how you're going to sustain your research given the teaching load that you're going to inherit. Budgets have shrunk. We don't protect people at the R1 in quite the way that we used to let them publish. What you don't want to do in an R1 interview is spend it like it's your comprehensive exams, convincing them you really are qualified, you really know what you need to know. They think that already or they wouldn't be bringing you in. What you need to do is say, I've looked at your catalog and I see these are the courses, find out what you're going to be doing. Whose niche are you filling? What expansion area are they hoping to go into? How does that dovetail with what you do? And how can your current pedagogy and teaching that you're going to be assigned there dovetail nicely with your research agenda so that you can make the case, hey, my program can be sustained in doing this. So before you ever walk in the door, you need to be thinking about institutional mission. Once you're going to a specific interview, you're like, oh, I know I'm going here and I'm going there, I think the goal shifts a little bit. You want to make sure, and the subtext is sort of the next 3 points about what to do when you know I'm going to this institution is this. You really want the committee at that point to understand you are interested in this job, not a job. Right? At the point at which I've brought you to campus, I'm hoping you like us, believe it or not. I'm hoping you're willing to live in Hammond, Louisiana is what I'm hoping, right? That's a hard thing to hope for people. But you really want to show them that they want to do this. So I would say to you, one tip I hope is beneficial. By the time I'm bringing you in for interview, some faculty members who you're dealing with, they're setting up the interview, the chair's too busy for this, the dean's not bothering with this. There's some faculty chair of the committee who drew the short straw and they're dealing with all of the state regulations to bring you in. Email that person as part of coming to campus, as they're setting that stuff up. Ask them to send you a copy of their annual evaluation instrument. Just say, hey, could you shoot me a copy of the thing that you guys fill out annually to convince your boss you're doing your jobs? Because it's going to give you a lot of information about what this institution values. That is a values document. If you were to get mine, for example, you would see 50% of my annual evaluation is teaching. Even though we have a master's program and even though I'm expected to publish 50, and it's first. Teaching is first on our annual evaluation instrument. If you were to pull IUs or LSUs, you might get a what's that, right? R1's a little different on how they handle that stuff, but I guarantee you teaching's not first on that list. Not only would you find out teaching is important at my institution, you would find out the first thing, 15,000 students, what do you think the first thing it says to document that you teach well at my institution is? Evals, student evals, it's true. The first thing they're going to say is student evals, but second for us is going to be grade distribution. What's grade distribution tell you as a little audience analysis piece? I expect some rigor in my course, right? You're not just a great teacher because you got good, we call them SOTs, student observation of teaching, because they don't evaluate, they just observe. My SOTs are going to be the first thing, but the next thing is going to be, and did you get that from giving them all an A, or do you have some standards, right? You're going to see mentoring is in there, and you're going to see involving undergraduates in research is in there. All right, so then you got to be thinking, well, what do I do that mentors students? What do I do? What are my grade distributions? You want, not only is it going to testify to the institution you want this job, but it's also going to help them know you're a fit or not, right, as you answer some of those questions. On research for us, you're going to see things like conference presentation is listed as research. That's not going to be true when you look at the R1, right? They're going to have journal peer-reviewed kind of thing. So it's going to give you a flavor for, are you applying for the right kind of position? Does this dovetail with what you hope to do? And let you speak intelligently to sort of their expectations. Service is going to list the kind of committees people in this department find themselves on because they give cheats to the faculty and say, have you done any of these kind of things this year? So I'd ask for that document. Second thing I tell you to do, Trevor Perry-Giles at NCA says, he tells people when they go on an interview, read an article by every member of the faculty before you go on the interview. And that's fine if you're at an R1 because every member of the faculty will have an article. That's not going to be appropriate for the community college, right? You're going to dig around on their website and see what kind of student organizations they've got, what kind of advising responsibilities they have, what kind of teaching load. But you need to do a little of that before you go to show interest, but also to be able to tailor your answers to the kinds of expectations they have. One of the things I really recommend people do is look at academia.edu, and it's A-C-A-D-E-M-E, academe.edu. And y'all are young people, you all already know about this. I'm an old fogey when it comes to the internet. But people post their CVs and they post their articles up there. You should look at it because it's an easy way to find out who they are. It's an easy way to find out their publications. But more importantly, they get a little bing when you go and search them. So when I'm in the midst of an interview committee, I get somebody in Slidell, Louisiana has searched you on academe.edu. And I'm like, we just hung up the phone with a woman we interviewed in Slidell, Louisiana. Isn't that interesting? It's a sign that she's interested, she's following up, she's taking it seriously. So you kind of want them to know you're looking at them. You want them to know you take what they do, and it shows you know about academe.edu. It's never a bad thing to look in the know, especially older faculty. That kind of stuff is sometimes more impressive than for some of you coming out who are more cutting edge on some of the tech. Read the local paper a little bit before you go, especially if you're applying in some of the small privates or regional institutions that are in Kokomo, Indiana, or Natchitoches, Louisiana. We interviewed a guy recently who, I won't name names in terms of his institution, but he was at a small private 2 states over, and we said, well, what makes you interested in this position? It's kind of a standard question we ask. And he said, well, we haven't had a pay raise in 4 years where I am. And everybody on the committee laughed because we haven't had a pay raise in 7 years where we are. And we thought, well, good for you. Just not knowing that 2 states over, we sort of felt he should have known. How could you not know Louisiana's budget scenario when it comes to higher education? So do a little digging, find out a little bit before you go. Some questions you can expect. I've been on enough search committees to know there are certain things they're going to ask you, really, that the dean's going to ask you, that the chair is going to ask you for sure. The faculty's probably going to ask you because they know the dean and chair are going to ask. So there are a few of these I think we can anticipate. You probably know some of them. What are some of the things you know you're going to get asked? We'll play your list versus mine. What's that? Why us? What makes you interested in this position is how we word it. Everybody's going to ask you that. What else? Okay, how do you address inequities in student performance? And that's going to be a big deal if you're someplace that's open admission, something like the community college that has remediation, or even some of the regional schools. I wouldn't say we have the most rigorous admission standards. We have uneven student performance. And that question can sometimes take the form of, how are you prepared to deal with students like ours? How are you prepared to teach students like ours? And not offer you much more than that, so that you need to know, is this a population with a lot of English as a second language students, or is this a population of a lot of non-traditional students? Or if they want to know, do you know what kind of students you'd be inheriting? All right, what else? What are your strengths and weaknesses? What is it, I care too much? Nobody wants to admit they have a weakness. We don't really ask that one anymore. We don't do the, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But I imagine a lot of search committees, that is a pretty basic, what do you see you bring to the table, and what do you maybe have to work against? My tip to you on all of these questions, and I'm going to give you some more and some examples, is think of those questions, no matter how the committee words it, as give me an example of a time when. That's how you ought to think of every question they ask you. Give me an example of a time when. They may not be asking you to do it in an examples-based way, but they should be. Because here's what happens when you leave the room. We did a phone interview with 15 people to narrow it down to the 3 we want to bring to campus. People had different impressions, and we stacked them up. 30-minute interviews back to back to back. We get together and we say, okay, who do you want to bring to campus? And people say things like, I like the lady who did that phone thing with her students, right? Like they'll pick some very specific example that you gave. No one says, I like the woman who thought promoting diversity was important. It's too abstract. I like the woman who thought service learning was important. It's too abstract. You have to give them an example, because that's what they hang their hat on when they're trying to sort through this pile of people and figure out who do we want to bring to campus. So let's go through the ones I think you're going to hit. Service learning or experiential learning. If the faculty doesn't ask it, I promise you the dean's going to ask it, because the dean is getting pressure about it from the legislature, and they're getting pressures from other folks. So you need to be able to say, what is something I do in my courses that is an example of experiential learning or service learning? Don't talk in general about thinking service learning is important. Don't tell them in general. Yes, people learn more when they do. Tell the story of, I had students work with clients, they pitched ideas, they decided to raise cell phones for the local women's shelter. They raised they collected 110 cell phones here on campus and presented them to the women's shelter and got to practice along the way, pitching and public speaking and executive summary writing. Get specific about how it ties back into your learning too. Don't just, it's not just a feel-good piece. Pull it together in terms of what they learned in the process. Learning outcomes. Your chair is going to ask you about it, I promise, because he or she is getting tremendous pressure to document student learning right now. So what's your experience with student learning outcomes? You can say, I went over to the booth here at NCA and I picked up the National Communication Association's Learning Outcomes in Communication, right? Trevor would love it if you did that. That's a big deal, we're using those. But do you evaluate on your own syllabus? Do you start with learning objectives? Do you know the difference between a goal and a measurable objective? Can you get a specific example? God bless you if you've participated in actual learning outcomes assessment. If you can say, oh yeah, we videotape all of our speeches every semester and a random sample of them get reviewed and I've participated on the team that reviews them. And I'd say to you, if you're not doing something related to learning outcomes, in addition to looking for a good interview answer here, go back to your campus and get involved in your learning outcomes initiative in some way. If I can hire somebody who's not only going to teach, but is going to help pull the wagon on some of these big institutional mandates, you're a double threat, right? You're more useful to me than somebody who can just do a good job teaching. You can also sustain these big departmental initiatives. Woohoo, I win. So they're looking for those kinds of answers. Engagement. How do you recruit, retain, and engage students? There's a lot of research that says students who are connected stay on campus. Do you facilitate connections in your classroom? Do you sponsor student organizations? If nothing else, what's your W rate on your average teaching in a semester? You know, my colleagues lose 10% of their students, I only lose 5. Can you speak with some specificity about how you hold on to students? Diversity is a big deal. You're going to get questions about it. I think especially in light of what's going on in Missouri and in Claremont, there's going to be, hey, we as a discipline care about diversity a good bit. How do we facilitate safe spaces for students to engage these issues? We got a lot of people taking their marbles and going home right now. That's not helpful as communication scholars. What do you do to help students address issues of race and class and gender and sexual orientation in the classroom? And you don't need to sound like a political partisan on the issue for it to be a meaningful conversation. We are about people being able to talk. How do you get that going on? Talk with some specifics. One question we always ask at the faculty level is, tell me about a time you've dealt with a student complaint. And boy, people answer that question in some very wrong ways. You do not want to say, I've never had a student complain. If you've never had a student grouse about something, you're doing something wrong, is the faculty perspective. You also don't want to tell the world's worst student complaint story about, oh, it was the grievance committee and I had to file a restraining order and I was being stalked. Like, don't tell that story I've heard that story. Don't tell that story either. That makes us nervous about you in some way. And that's not fair, but it does. You want to tell a story that's a reasonable, these are the kind of issues and here's how I addressed them. We want to know that you've had students complain. It's okay if your rate my professor stuff says mean things about you. It's okay. We don't expect, they say mean things about us too. We don't expect students to love you. We expect you to cover the information. We want them to like you. We want you to be a good teacher that they respect. But it's okay to say, I taught a lot of public speaking as a graduate student. I was young. I felt like as a young woman, they pushed back a little bit when I would give a C. Why are you giving me a C? And so I instituted what I call the 24/7 rule, where I said, you got to wait 24 hours before you come complain, but you can't wait more than 7 days because I'm not going to remember what you're complaining about. And just giving them that breathing space made it so they didn't come angry. They'd at least read the comments, and we were able then to have a much more informed discussion about improving their performance rather than them being mad about their grade. Just that little bit of a story puts you in a position to say, oh, they've taught a lot, they know students grouse, they have a plan for dealing with it. It makes you a colleague, makes you somebody we can trust has had similar experiences. Grant writing. The faculty may or may not ask you, the chair is going to ask you, the dean's going to ask you, what experience have you had securing funds? What experience have you had writing grants? The wrong answer is none, right? I've had, my favorite answer I ever got on this was, what experience do you have writing grants? And he said, writing them plenty, getting them not much. Don't say that. How many of you had some funding to come here to NCA? If nothing else, you can say, I've been successful at securing funds to support my research and attendance to the National Communication Association. I get the nature of having to write those things. As I move into my profession, I know, that there are these options available to me. If you've actually written and secured some grants, I brought in $2,500 to put in a mobile classroom for our university. Say what it was you did. That's, again, that's a kind of a double threat thing. I think you can get hired without it, certainly at the community college and at the teaching intensive colleges. It's probably more expected at the R1 that you've done it before you come, but even still, you want some sort of indication that you get it and that you're hoping to move in that direction. There are some questions I think you can't quite expect. One of my favorites was a history professor when we were interviewing so much at the community college who would wait until people were leaving. Like they had to have their satchel on their arm and have their hand on the door, and he would go, oh, one more thing. What's the last book you read? And people would get caught really flat-footed. It was funny. They would just pause. He didn't want to hire anybody who wasn't a reader. And that's one thing you have to know. People have weird pet peeves. I had a woman who wouldn't hire anybody who interviewed in an open toe either. I was like, really? What do you care what kind of shoe she has on? People can be strange. So interview committees are not necessarily rational. I will just put that out there. They're not. Decisions get made for some really reasons that sometimes have very little to do with you as the candidate. So take solace in that if you didn't get the job you wanted. And I tell you, take solace if you get the job by being second place too. Some of the best hires I ever made were my second choice hire. First turned us down and we had to go to second choice. They turned out to be wonderful colleagues. So don't let that bother you either. Search committees don't really have a crystal ball about how this is all going to work out. They're people like you and me doing the best that they can do. But back to my story on Wayne asking people, hey, what's the last book you read? Faculty don't do it as much as HR does it, but you know HR professionals are trained to ask you questions like, if you were a spirit animal, what would you be? My daughter always says narwhal because I get to the point. I'm like, well, maybe don't say that. But, or how many VWs, I mean, how many, what are those little things called? When you play the little ping pong, how many ping pong balls can you fit in a VW? Those kinds of questions. I had one ask me, what was the last book you read for your avocation? They'll ask you these kind of questions sometimes just to see how you think on your feet. And my answer to you, if you get one of these, and not too many, I don't think too many faculty committees do this to be frank, but if you get it, don't panic. Take a beat and say, well, I don't know. I'd have to measure ping pong balls and VWs and do some math. I have friends for that. Right? You can give them an answer. The avocation guy actually happened to me. He asked, and I was 28, I was coming out of my PhD program, and he says, what's the last book you read for your avocation? And I thought, hobby or job, and I didn't really know. And I should have thought vocation, no vocation. I should have gone there, but I went with job. So I read whatever I had last read, I think it was Harriman's Political Style, whatever I'd last read for graduate school. And he nodded knowingly, so I knew I'd gotten it wrong. And we went a little further, and when we wrapped up the interview, I asked him, it was the president of a community college who was doing it, and a really neat guy, and I said to him, why'd you ask me that question? And he said, well, I didn't think you'd know what the word meant, and I wanted to see, were you the kind of person who, when you didn't know something, would ask, or are you the kind of person who'll just blurt something out? And I was like, well, I guess we know, right? I did not get that job. That's okay. You're not going to get every job that you go for, and I don't know that it was just for that reason, but sometimes they get you, and it's okay. Don't panic about it if they do. The final thing I want to say before I sort of open it up and answer questions for you if I can is just some do's and don'ts for the phone or Skype interview. Before you go to campus, a lot of times, faculty committees, budgets being what they are, will phone or Skype interview you to try and winnow it down to a few people that we want to spend the time and energy to bring to campus. And a couple of tips just from my recent experience with this. First off, this is not the interview to ask about money. The salary range is probably posted on the HR website. We don't even know if we want to bring you to campus yet. I really don't want to dither with you about how much we're going to pay you yet. I wouldn't ask about flex time in this interview yet, even though I think like if you go to an R1, you absolutely should negotiate for a Tuesday, Thursday teaching schedule to make sure you have time for your research, right? So you can do that. You don't do that until after you're offered the position. Negotiate money, negotiate time after you've got the post. Those are not early interview questions. Do ask, what makes for a good colleague? What are you looking for in a colleague? If you can get that answer out of them at the phone interview or at the Skype interview and you make your way to campus, you can know, oh, well, they really seem to care about someone who wanted to do committee work or somebody who really wanted to do research or somebody who, whatever it is they're looking for, you'll know if this is even one you should go on the interview for. What are they looking for in a good colleague? Don't talk about kids and commitment. Other commitments outside of work yet, and women, I'm talking especially to you. It's illegal for them to ask you, but man, women will volunteer some stuff. We interviewed a woman recently who wanted to commute almost 2.5 hours into the institution on a Tuesday, Thursday schedule because she had twins, and she told us this in the phone interview. That's a rough, and it's not about her having kids, it's just, people questioned her commitment to the institution at that point. If you talk openly in the interview, it's wrong. I think there's sexism there. I have real problems with some of what I heard from the committee, but I do think you can raise a hackle for the committee that, oh, you're looking for this to be flexible for you. They're looking for you to come in and help them. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be flexible for you. It doesn't mean I interviewed for my first job. I was like 4 weeks pregnant, so I didn't tell anybody I was pregnant till 7 months on the job. I just kept getting a little bigger and a little bigger, and they all knew at some point. I didn't say anything, right? That's not great as women, I think, that we can sometimes feel that pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I am saying don't give committees reasons, especially early on, to ask. They're not supposed to ask. Don't give them an excuse to discriminate against you. Do ask about courses. I would want to know not just course load, I'd want to know what courses they see you stepping into. It makes a difference to how well this can sustain your research agenda. It makes a difference. You don't want to come in and say, oh, I'm so interested in teaching X, Y, and Z, and find out that the head of the search committee teaches X, Y, and Z and isn't keen to give those up, right? You do kind of need to know where do they see you falling into existing offerings so that you know how to position yourself in answering those questions. The final thing I'll say about do's and don'ts, and you would not think this is necessary, but my lived experience says that it is, you need to be thoughtful about where you do your phone interviews. I've had a guy answer walking his dog on the beach. We didn't call him out of nowhere. He knew we were calling. I had a woman with cats walking past in the Skype interview. Just, a little cat would wander past. Another guy who, when we started, says, I live in a really rural place. I have a dodgy connection. So we spent the most part of the interview with him half frozen and us wondering if he heard us or not. Go into town and do this at Starbucks. Pick some place where this will go well for you. And I wouldn't think people would make, those are rookie mistakes. And yet I've seen people do it. You need to think some of that out. Had another guy took the call in his office and said, this was the same one he said he hadn't had a pay raise in 4 years. He literally did one of these. Hold on a second, I'm in my office. I'm going out to my car. And he kept us on the phone while he went out to his car and shut the door and did the rest of the interview in his car. Again, we scheduled the phone interview. He knew we were calling. Those are easy no's, right? Don't give them an easy no. So in the upshot of this whole thing I hope you take away is, one, the interview doesn't have to go perfectly. People screw stuff up. It's all right if in general you communicate how you fit the position, you know what the position is, and you're good about telling your story to the committee. You need to analyze them, and then you need to think about how you fit and tell your story. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. If there are things I can answer for you, I'm going to repeat questions because I know we're hard to hear, but that's sort of my song and dance. She asks, how do you find out who's on the interview committee? And usually the person who contacts you to set up the phone interview or to set up the Skype interview, or if you're coming to campus, they know. They're almost always the chair of the committee, and they can tell you. And I would ask it this way. I would say, hey, I've looked at your list of faculty members, and I see you have people in this area and that area. Would you mind sharing with me who's the search committee? Because I want to make sure I really take a look at their stuff in particular. Let them know you're doing your homework. Okay. Right here. One more time. She asked, what are my thoughts on disclosing a disability? I think you don't do it until after you do the campus interview. I think you get to campus. Now, if you've got mobility issues, and campus is going to need to accommodate that when they bring you in, let them know as they're setting up you come into campus. And I will say this, as much as I worried about being a pregnant woman and that kind of thing, our committees have been really remarkably, discrimination-free, I would say, in terms of thinking about accommodating people with disabilities. We've got older faculty, we've got mobility issues, we've got visual issues, visual impairment issues. Faculty tend, I think, to really want to be fair. So I wouldn't tell them until they bring you to campus or until you're coming to campus. I wouldn't tell them in an application letter. I wouldn't tell in a phone interview, Skype interview. But at the point at which they're bringing me to campus, they like you. They think you're qualified. I don't think I don't think it should raise feathers at that point. And if it does, they're in the wrong. They're legally in the wrong, right? So, okay. Any other interview tips, questions? We got it? Okay. Okay, she asked questions about technology and what are our expectations in terms of you knowing about your learning management systems or teaching online or a flipped classroom. Obviously, we were talking earlier about things that make you a double threat. I would want to know a little bit about the institution. And again, you've got a connection as they're setting up the interview with you. Ask that person even before you get there, how many of your courses are taught online? In a typical class, is it hybrid? How much is, this way or that way? Do you use Blackboard? Do you use Moodle? Do you use some other learning management system? I do think there are some positions, especially if they're going to expect you to teach online, where that's going to be in the position, it's going to be stated overtly, you're going to have to show what you know about technology. I think there are some positions where it doesn't matter a whole lot, it's not real germane to the position, But even there, they would expect you to be able to post things on Moodle or post things on Blackboard. I mean, just some real basic. I wouldn't want to raise alarms for a committee that I didn't know how to do anything with a computer, not in this day and age. So if you're not proficient, I will say to you, go to YouTube and put using Moodle, posting a syllabus on Moodle, find out whatever system they're on. There are videos on YouTube for everything you do on Moodle, keeping a grade book on Moodle, and the same thing for Blackboard. Posting a syllabus on Blackboard, it'll teach you how to do it. You probably have a Center for Faculty Excellence that can help you. That's kind of a basic skill nowadays. I would assume most candidates coming in can log in and use those things. Right. We kind of assume you are proficient. I guess we don't explore it real deeply. I assume everybody can do that at this point, unless we're looking for somebody to teach specifically online. And then I would expect you to really be able to talk meaningfully about how do you use the adaptive textbook, how do you flip the classroom, those kinds of things. So, and again, if you are good at that, even if the position doesn't call for it, that's one of those double threat things where you could say, not only can I come in and do what you're asking me to do, I bring this added skill of I'm techie and I can help some of your other folks be techie, and I'll certainly bring that to our students. So it's not a bad thing to advertise. If you're comfortable and you know it, absolutely let it shine. If you're not, though, I wouldn't draw a lot of attention to it, and I would gear up. I would get those skills. You need them. International interviewees. One of the things I will say to international interviewees is the phone interview is tough for you. If you're not a native speaker, it can be hard for the committee. They're usually sitting around on someone's iPhone. They don't have the great conference technology like you would imagine at a Cisco kind of thing. So if I was an international applicant, I would push for a Skype interview rather than phone, offer to set it up, FaceTime, something. I think the added nonverbal is going to help. It just makes it easier for us to understand each other. So I think if you have a language barrier. And the second tip I would give you as an international student, or an international applicant rather, make sure you indicate something about your willingness to go to that school and be in that location. I've seen committee members say, well, she's up in Chicago, why would she, that's not a connection to Louisiana. A lot of times our applicants or somebody's got some kind of local connection. You do need to spend a little time in the cover letter saying to the committee, I know where your institution is and I'm willing to move there. And you want to say that more artfully, obviously, than that. But something that says, oh, Hammond interests me because it sits between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, because nothing about Hammond interests anyone in and of itself. So you could mention how close it is to two cities that are interesting, and that may be enough for the committee to say, oh, she's really considering us, not just doing a 400 application kind of approach. Okay. She asked, even though it's illegal for them to, what do you do if they ask one of these hot button issues that they're not supposed to ask you about? I'm on a panel Sunday morning, and one of my colleagues is expressly talking about that. And I don't have great answers for that, because I'm the one on the committee going, that's not legal, you can't ask about this, and this. So I wouldn't want to blow an interview over it, but I wouldn't want to be discriminated against either. So what you want to look for is artful ways to redirect. So don't feel like you have to answer a question, but you don't have to indicate how aggravated you are that they would ask, kind of thing. If you can find, and we're communicators, right? We have multiple answers. I would envision for myself, what are the cruddy ways they could come at this information and not do this right, and what would my answer be to push this in a different direction? Most faculty committees try really hard to be good about this. I remember actually when I got the position that I'm in, I had mentioned my kids in the interviewing process, and when we went out to eat lunch, the chair said, and Claire's got 2 kids, and I did not ask her that. She disclosed she's got 2 kids, kind of thing. I mean, so faculty know we're aware, and we're sensitive to communication, especially in our field. So I can't promise you nobody would ask something inappropriate, but they've been trained, they went through HR training. So I'll have a better answer for you Sunday. If you get my business card, I'll find out what Helen has said about this, because she's had this happen a few times, and she's like, I've got my answers down now. So, but I would say look to finesse it rather than to straight up call them out on it, but don't answer questions you don't want to answer. Okay, she asked if I had other tips for the other parts of the interviewing process, if you have to do a job talk or if you have to teach. First off, I'd make it clear which of them they ask you to do. My institution, we usually have them do a job talk, which is funny because it's a teaching job, but we let them come in and do hey, let me talk to you about my research, because we're confident we can discern whether or not you're going to be okay at teaching, I guess. We're not as confident we're going to know if you're really going to research or not. I don't know why we do it that way, but we do. So we've had them teach too. I can't say that. We have occasionally had them teach. Find out who's going to be in your audience. A lot of times they'll cobble together some mixed audience. It's faculty and some students. So, and you're talking about your research, that's okay. If you're teaching, that's a little fictive and a little weird. If you're taking over an actual classroom, well, what's going on in your classroom right now? I would say don't go wildly different than if it's a teaching talk, your teaching style. Try and show what you really do. But I would be organized. One of the mistakes I've seen candidates make is they try and teach the talk, the job, if they're doing the teaching talk, like it's their own classroom and they're in the middle of the semester, and you're not. It's really kind of almost first day for you. These are new students, they don't know you, you don't have the rapport you would have with your own students. So something where you visually reinforce kind of your main points, do those good teaching techniques we all know we're supposed to do, preview where you're gonna go, don't bite off more than you can chew. Try and teach them 3 concepts. You do that in 50 minutes, you're doing great. Keep it simple. Have something that's interactive. Pick your best lecture that you want to give. I mean, if you've got an activity or a lecture you do that works really well, do that, even if you have to, I can finagle that on into an interpersonal classroom. It's really a public speaking thing, but I can make that work. Do something you know you do well. Do something you have done before. This is not the time to experiment. And then at the end, be sure to bring it back around and say, so I think you know X, Y, and Z. The job talk is more, I think, is a different deal. If you're doing something on your research, pulled out of your dissertation, pulled out of your current research agenda, that's going to vary institution to institution. At the R1, I think that needs to look like a colloquium you went to as a graduate student. That's what is expected. If it's at the small private, I think it needs to be interesting, not necessarily, some of what might appear in a paper might not have to make its way into the oral presentation. I think you need to be engaging. A lot of times they're going to have a hybrid audience and they're going to expect you to make it accessible to students while convincing faculty it's drawing on the theories and methodologies of the field. So I don't know if that really answers so much as just describes, but that would be my tips. That's right. Remember your public speaking. That's exactly right. Okay. Oh, I like that. She says when they ask about family on hot button issues, you can kind of flip it and just say, oh, mom and dad are doing great. That's a wonderful idea. Just a nice way to sort of skip the interrogation. That's an interesting question. Visas can be difficult, especially for the faculty committee has no clue how that happens. That happens out of HR, they're completely separate. So what I would, in terms of handling that, I would treat the interview with the faculty, with the dean, with the chair as all about my qualifications for doing this position. If we're interested in you, we're just going to say we want to hire you, and then HR is going to have to work that out. There's probably something that HR makes you do in the application process that says, do you have the basic things you need for being able to apply and work in this country? So you'll deal with that. You'll deal with it with HR. I wouldn't let it scare me off from approaching the committee and the teaching in the department from the perspective of I could do this job and do it well for you. Let HR deal with that. All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.